Hello, and welcome to Pacific Mammal Research's Marine Mammal Highlight Series. We are a research and education nonprofit studying marine mammals in the Salish Sea off Washington State. In this series, you will learn about different marine mammals as we discuss the interesting facts about each species and debate which one we think is the best. Of course, we think all marine mammals are awesome. This is just our way to geek out, share some information, and have some fun. We hope you enjoy this series, and if you want to hear about a particular marine mammal, let us know in the comments. And without further ado, welcome to the next episode of Marine Mammal Highlights. Today we are going to be talking about the beaked whales, kind of following up from the porpoises that we don't know much about because not much has been studied. We're doing this with beaked whales because there's not much is done and not much has been studied because these guys are hard to study. So Trevor's going to give us a little bit of background on the generic grouping of beaked whales, and then Kat and I are each going to talk about a couple of cool ones. So Trevor, go ahead.
All right. So there were previously 19 confirmed species, but now there's debate whether there's 22 confirmed species with more and more stranded individuals.
Yeah, I saw anywhere from like there's 17, 19, 20, 21.
Yeah, I think the general consensus is 22 now.
Okay.
Which I'm sure will change with DNA and all that stuff.
Right.
But they really only know much about 3 to 4 of them, which is the 3 or 4 that we're going to talk about today.
Right.
But mainly they live in deep water environments because they are deep divers for their food, which is generally squid or deep water fish and occasionally crustaceans. They range from sizes of 13 to 35 or 40 feet, again, based on strandings and minimal sightings of them. But the unique characteristics of them is with the name beaked whale, they have a beaked face. So kind of like what a bottlenose dolphin would look like, the melon, and then the very small snout.
Mm-hmm.
Their fluke does not have a notch in the middle. So most whales, if you look at their tail, it's the classic paddle shape with the converging into a notch into the middle. They don't, except for one species, which I don't remember which one that is.
Yeah, and that's I said, look at that picture. I know, and I'm like, I wouldn't have noticed it until you said it, and then now it's like, wow, how did I not know?
Exactly.
So weird.
I wonder what the purpose of that is, like the functionality of why they wouldn't have a notch versus having a notch.
I mean, I would think just more surface area, even that little bit, that extra surface area gives you more power to dive down.
Deep dive, so right? Yeah.
But then the larger larger baleen whales ones have it, and they dive deep too. So I don't know.
Yeah, who knows?
But I guess the biggest or most well-known characteristic, which you guys are going to expand more on, is their teeth, which act more like tusks, so they don't actually use their teeth for feeding.
And they only have like a pair.
Yeah, they have 1 to 2 pairs, usually one, and it's a usual form of sexual dimorphism. So the males, it's very visible, like protruding out of their mouth, whereas the females, they don't actually erupt out of the gums.
Right.
So
but they're hidden.
Exactly. So the males usually use them, well, not usually, but sometimes use them for combat with each other for females. And then there a thought that the teeth could be a secondary sexual characteristic for the beaked whales, as in like a deer's antler. So if you have a nice large tooth, theoretically attractive. Yeah.
Right. You've done very well because you've got big teeth. So obviously you're a good one to mate with. Yeah.
As a deep diving animal, like I mentioned, they have larger than normal spleens and livers compared to other cetaceans. So they use that. Those basically are for filtering blood and getting oxygen throughout the body and just getting rid of bad things in the blood, essentially, while they're diving, such as nitrogen buildup.
Right. Yeah. And the thing is, if you have the ability to carry more red blood cells, you have the ability to carry more oxygen, which makes you allowed to stay down longer.
Right.
Yeah.
And you'll mention it later, but some of them they can fold their flippers in to be streamlined with their body, versus other cetaceans are just kind of out there, but they can actually fold them flat and be like torpedo shaped.
And they do really look torpedo-y.
Yeah, they're very
their bodies.
Then their feeding method is cool. They don't, like I said, they don't use their teeth for feeding, but they'll actually do suction feeding. So they have 2 grooves on their throat, which they can then expand, and that just brings in a bunch of water, which is where their prey is. So the prey just goes in with the water, usually squid. So that's how their main feeding function is, which is
like going down a drain.
I think it's really cool. Yeah, I mean that's the primary form of feeding in fish. which I thought was quite exciting. But
That is super cool.
Yeah, it's a very different one because toothed whales they usually grab and then swallow. The baleen whales they filter feed, just take in large groups of things. But this is like
Yeah.
well, and
Super
actually
cool.
sperm whales will do that too. And the same thing, they have these big teeth, but they don't really use it for grasping that much. They basically suck the squid in.
exactly.
Yeah.
But yeah, they found in every ocean at the poles, but we just don't see them much because we're not in the open ocean as much as observers. So most information we get from are strandings or in locations that are located in deep water, like Hawaii and the Caribbean.
Right, where the deep water butts up to the land,
Right,
like
where
it
it's
goes
easy to,
really steep really
theoretically
quickly.
easier to find them. Yeah.
Yeah.
And they don't do well in captivity. They're only, I think the longest streak they had one in captivity was 25 days before it died.
And I've never even heard of a
I don't know how
whale
they
in
got
captivity.
captivity. Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, really.
But for that reason, that's hard to study.
Right. Well, and also if they're spending most of their time at depth, like you can't simulate that in an environment. So
a few miles away. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
Like here's your bathtub that is
Right.
100 feet deep,
Poor
but
things.
you go 1,000. That's not gonna be good.
But yeah,
Interesting.
we don't know a whole lot. I mean, you guys will go dive more into it per species, but that's general.
The general consensus that covers most of the beaked whales. And then I say each one has their own little fun things about them that are a little bit different. So I'm going to be talking about the Cuviers first, and then the northern bottlenose whale, and then Kat will talk about.
I will talk about the Blainevilles beaked whale and the Bairds beaked whale.
Okay. So the Cuviers is Ziphius cavirostris, and the Cuvier comes from the fact that this guy named Cuvier described it in 1823. But what he described was a skull that he found. And he found that the skull had the rostrum, so we call the mouth that comes out the beak or the rostrum, same thing. That part of the skull was really heavily ossified, so really dense bone. And it also had a prenareal cavity, so this cavity that's in front of the nares or the nostrils. And because of that ossification, he thought it was an extinct species. He thought it was a fossil. So it wasn't until 1872 a guy named Turner was like, no, this is not a fossil. This is actually a real species that exists today. So that
must have been pretty cool to like be the one to realize that. Like, wait a second, no, it still exists.
Exactly, like it's here. And the cavirostris part of their name is basically named for that cavity that they have. And they are the only ones in the Ziphius genus that have that ossification and that prenareal cavity. So it's kind of unique to the Cuviers. They are mid-range on the size. They are 15 to 23 feet and 4,000 to 6,800 pounds. Again, they have those 2 teeth at the lower jaw, like tusks, but the females don't have any visible teeth. They're still submerged underneath their gums. They are generally kind of gray with a darker top and a lighter bottom. That's going to be pretty common for most of these beaked whale species. The older males, the head and the back are white. So it's a little bit of sexual dimorphism there. Some may appear brownish because of algae in where they're at, and that happens with other cetaceans as well. And what's interesting, if you look, these guys kind of have a darker body, and then their head is white, and then they have these dark rings around their eyes, like little pandas. And to me, it actually almost looked like somebody put white mime face on the whale. And so they get scars from cookie cutter sharks. So these are little guys that just come out and take little cookie cutter bites out of you each time which is just creepy. But what's cool is you can find out where certain cetaceans are that get these bites, because based on where the cookie cutter sharks are, you can know where these guys were. And the males do fight, so they will rake each other with their teeth. And so they are very heavily scarred between the cookie cutter sharks and the teeth marks from the raking, and they use that for photo ID. And in Hawaii, like I said, it's easier to study these guys in areas like that where the deep water butts up to the land quite close to shore, has been shown for at least 8 years, and in other places that's up to 15 years. So you think a lot of offshore species as not really having site fidelity to a particular area, but these guys do seem to have that. It seems to be a fairly consistent thing that they found.
Yeah.
They usually live in groups of 2 to 7, and you can find them alone, but they are social. And this is going to be fairly similar for most of the species we talk about. Life expectancy, we really don't know for any of these guys, but it's expected that it could be up to 60 years. The oldest one was 30 to 40 years old that was stranded that they know of. Sexually mature at around 11 years. And again, that's going to be pretty consistent with the animals that we talk about today. And they're thought to reproduce at a very low rate every few years.
Okay.
But again, we don't know. They they feed on, which they do live on, at least 47 different species of squid.
Wow. Okay.
So, and they're really special. That's what they eat. They don't really eat, occasionally will eat a fish or a crustacean, but they're squid eaters, basically.
Interesting.
So they do those deep dives in the suction feeding, like Trevor talked about with those 2 throat grooves. They are the most frequently cited species of beaked whale. So, and that's when I hear beaked whale, I think of Cuviers. That's the one you hear about all the time.
Yeah.
They're found in most oceans worldwide, from the equator up to cold temperate waters. They're not in the Arctic or the Antarctic, but pretty much they're kind of like bottlenose dolphins in that way. They're circumpolar, but just not in the poles. They have the most extensive range of all beaked whale species. So again, they are the bottlenose of the whale world, the beaked whale world. So as Trevor mentioned before, they have flipper pockets, which I think is the coolest thing ever. Just want, like, I hate it when my pants don't have pockets. I want dresses to have pockets. Like, pockets are just essential. So these guys are super cool because they actually have pockets. So their flippers can slip in there, and so it just makes them that much more streamlined so that their torpedo body can dive down deep.
So cool.
Yeah, I think that's one of the coolest things ever. If I was a cetacean, I would want flipper pockets.
I guess the sperm whales, they kind of do that too, don't they? They don't have the pockets, but I think they can.
They don't have pockets, but yeah,
they'll squish in.
They'll go like that. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a similar ideal, I suppose, as a deep diving animal.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They just have the upper hand because they actually have pockets. Which goes to, like, why do these ones have it? Maybe other ones don't. Like, which one came first, right? Did they develop it, or did they all have it and then some of them lost it? I don't know.
Right.
Interesting. They have the record for the deepest dive at almost 3,000 meters. So that's what, almost 9,000 feet, right? Because meters are about 3 feet. So that's almost 2 miles. And the longest dive for any mammal over 2 hours, 137.5 minutes.
Wow. So
they can hold their breath a really long time. But most dives are between 1,000 and 2,000. Like, that's the extreme, obviously, but they're not doing that all the time. And Trevor, didn't you mention something about that they will vary their dive lengths?
Yeah, so they if they do a deep dive, like a few deep dives early in the day, for example, they'll do far less later in the day, just because they basically think they need to recover. Kind of like us as scuba divers, we need a break after we dive. Like
right, you have to calculate. I've been down this long, so I need to stay this long up at the surface, and
can't fly for 24 hours, and
right. No more deep dives for you for at least 24 hours. Okay. So it's kind of cool that they do that on their own.
Yeah.
And that's my dog. Dogs are great. So they often strand, and this is common for most of these species. Because of where they live in those canyons, or they dive in those canyons a lot. They're in those deep water. So when the military uses their sonar and does these different tests, it goes out and they're often in these same areas. It then bounces off the side of the walls, and it causes them to either get disoriented, or they freak out and they surface too quickly. So the same as we will get the bends if we come up too quickly with the nitrogen bubbling out of our blood. Cetaceans generally don't get that, or they do and they can just deal with it better. But these, if they come up too quickly, it's going to happen. And so that's oftentimes what happens is they get these mass strandings after these sonar events have happened, where they come up too quickly. A whole bunch of them strand either because they're disoriented, and they don't know where they're going and they end up beaching themselves, or they actually have found that they have ruptured eardrums and other damage that comes from that, either the sound itself or the fact that they rose too quickly from the water. So
Gotcha.
that the military sonar testing and things like that are specifically worse for these guys than other cetaceans. So that's what I got for the Cuviers.
Cuviers. Okay. So I'm going to talk first about the Blainevilles beaked whale. And this, in contrast to the Cuviers, this is one of those ones that we really know very little about. We don't see this one very often at all. So the Latin name for these guys is Mesoplodon densirostris. And they are kind of a mid-size beaked whale. They're between 1,800 and 2,300 pounds, between 15 and 20 feet, typically. And these are an example of a beaked whale that has those tusks. So the males have one pair of visible tusk-like teeth that erupt and point forward, so kind of in the lower jaw area. And these guys have a really arched lower jaw too, and the male's jaw is more arched than the female. So that's something that you can actually use to tell the different sexes apart if you're in the field.
So the males are smiling more than the females.
Sure. There you go.
They're like,
grinning,
hey, how are you doing?
So similarly, the females and juveniles have teeth as well, but they don't have the external teeth. So they have a few that are erupted in their mouth, but they don't actually protrude out.
Interesting.
So they are in there. They're just, and you can see them. They're just not
right. Because in ours, in the Cuviers, they're not erupted.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. They haven't erupted at all. Yeah. So they do have teeth, but they just don't have the external tusks. And because they're not using the tusks really, except for potentially fighting or displaying, they can actually become encrusted with barnacles. So it's something that you can use to tell age. Is it the more barnacles you have on your tusks, as you might be a little older, been around longer.
I've never heard of barnacles on teeth.
It's so cool.
So cool. I mean, like,
it gives a new meaning to long in the tooth, right?
That right, long in the tooth and being old and crusty.
Yeah, there you go. There you go. Maybe all these things came from beaked whales. Who knows? So like I said, they're kind of a medium size. They have a pretty round body, small, wide-based dorsal fin that is slightly falcate, and it's about 2/3 of the way back on their body.
Right, which is that position is common for all the beaked whale species, where it's just it's more like the mysticetes, where the dorsal fin is way far back.
Yep, a little further back there
compared to the body.
And again, right, all the things. So similar to the Cuviers, the coloration is, again, it's darker on top, a little bit lighter underneath. And again, with these guys, the face can actually be paler as well with the Blainevilles.
So I wonder if that's a thing with beaked whales, because they're all a lot like that. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. I wasn't really aware of that until I started researching this. It's kind of interesting. Yeah. And again, their skin is covered in scars, a lot of times from fighting amongst themselves or potentially from their prey. We don't really know if it's it might be a little bit of both. So like I said, with the Blainevilles, we don't know much about them. Their lifespan is unknown. We don't even have a good estimate of how long they live. We do think that they reach sexual maturity at around about 9 years old. And part of the reason we don't know much about these ones specifically is because of where they live. So they are typically deep water dwellers. They don't really come in closer to shore at all. They live offshore. Water is between 650 and 3,000 feet in depth. Typically off the continental shelves is where they like to be. They are found in tropical and temperate waters around the world. But again, we don't know much about where they live within that really, because we don't see them very often. The other thing is they're really cryptic.
They're here.
Right, exactly. So these guys are almost like harbor porpoises in the sense that they are very cryptic when they come to the surface too. They don't spend a lot of time there.
Right.
And they're not doing much when they're at the surface. There is a difference between them and the Bairds beaked whales that I'll talk about later. Mm-hmm. But when these guys are at the surface, they're kind of just resting, they're taking in oxygen again, and then they dive again. Right. So they're cryptic, and they also seem to be quite skittish around boats. So they won't, if they see a boat coming, they'll actively move away from it.
Right.
They are, however, thought to have one of the widest distributions of the beaked whales, even though we don't know a ton about it. And here in the U.S. waters, we do have 3 specific stocks that NOAA has delineated for management. So we have the Hawaii stock, the Northern Gulf of Mexico stock, and the Western North Atlantic stock. And then in terms of food and behavior, so food, they eat cephalopods and small fish at depth. So like Trevor was mentioning, they'll do that suction feeding. They are a little more conservative with their diving. They're typically diving between 20 to 45 minutes. Dives of up to 54 minutes have been documented. And these guys are typically in like 1,600 to 3,000 feet of water with their dives, have been documented up to 4,600 feet, which is over 1,500 meters. So significantly less than the Cuviers can do. But still, still deep diving, obviously. And one of the really cool things, like I said, we don't know much about them, but it is really cool what they do when they're in groups. So again, similar to the Cuviers, seen individually or in small groups of about 3 to 7 animals. But they think that their groups will segregate based on age or sex. So they found that they've actually have what they call harems of females in a group with one adult male. And then the adult males will basically battle it out to take control of that harem of females. So it's kind of fascinating. You don't see that too often in cetaceans at all.
I think that's I don't think I've ever heard it in cetaceans.
Yeah.
I mean, pinnipeds, it's fairly common, but that's like you got this little spot of land and you can, patrol the perimeter and keep your females in check. But in the water, you have 3D everywhere. Like, how do you keep them? And
intensely, very deep depths too. It's like, okay. Yeah. So that's super cool. Impressive. I thought it was really interesting that we know that, and yet we really don't know much about them at all, but we've figured that part out. I thought that was pretty cool.
That is very cool.
In terms of threats to these guys, the main ones are, again, ocean noise, similar to what Cindy mentioned earlier. Naval sonar military exercises can cause a startle response and have that same problem. The other main one for these guys, and actually all of the beaked whales, but it seems like these guys are potentially a little bit more susceptible, is entanglement. So they have been found caught in the drift gill nets off the US Atlantic coast and also in the Indian Ocean with Japanese fishing boats. I think they use a similar gill net method. And what, it's just entanglement is something that a lot of marine mammals struggle with.
Yeah.
And apparently
gill nets just are bad for, porpoises. They're bad for the
gill nets kind of take everything, unfortunately. So that is one of the main issues for these guys. And also the ingestion of marine debris as well. So because of the suction feeding method that they use, they will just suck up anything that looks like food. And obviously they can tell to a certain degree, but if you have wads of plastic or, pieces of trash that are thrown in there and they suck it up, that gets ingested. So they have had a lot of animals who've stranded and have significant amounts of marine debris in their stomachs.
Yeah, I saw that on some of mine too. And that's just what's impressive is that's, again, we're not talking about shallow water.
Yeah.
We're talking about 3,000 feet way offshore. We've managed to get trash there.
Yeah. So that's kind of what I have for the Blainevilles. Like I said, they are definitely one of the lesser known beaked whales to start off with.
All right, so then the next one we have is the northern bottlenose whale, or Hyperoodon ampullatus. And it comes from the Latin ampulla, which is for the bottle shape of their beak. So they are called the bottlenose whale because it literally looks like a bottlenose rostrum or beak on a whale body.
I mean, like Google this one specifically. Like this is just such a weird looking whale.
Yeah. Like for the video one here, we'll have a picture for you. But if you're listening on the podcast, like Google it because it's a really weird looking whale, and it's got this big giant forehead, which I'll talk about in a minute. But so it's got a very, very pronounced beak compared to the other beaked whales. They are the largest of the beaked whale family in the North Atlantic, up to 16,500 pounds, and the females can get up to about 28 feet, and the males almost 37 feet. And again, estimated because we just don't know. They are darker brown into olive coloration and might appear mottled, and they are often covered with scars and markings. But the mature females often have a white band around their neck, and I don't know why. Yeah, usually it's the males that get some kind of weird, like the sexual secondary characteristic that we talked about, but maybe they just like necklaces and it looks pretty. I don't know. So the melon that they have, like I said, if you look at the picture or look up a picture, the melon, the forehead is very striking. So it doesn't, the Cuviers and some of the other ones, they have a more kind of shallow slope to the head as it goes out to the beak. These guys, it's like out and down. So as they get older, and I believe this is for males and females, it becomes steeper and flatter as the whale ages.
So almost more of a box out kind of boxy shape.
Exactly. So instead of it curving down, it just goes so you have like a flat forehead. Or as we like to call, we have a 4-head, but if you have a really big forehead, you have a 5-head. So
it's odd too, because it's not exactly streamlined.
yeah, right. And you're
Yeah.
trying to be like a torpedo to dive down.
Huh.
But what they do, the males use it for, is actually headbutting. So that's how they fight. They don't use their teeth, which is unusual because most of the other beaked whale species, they rake each other. So perhaps that flattened forehead is just really good for ramming each other.
Right.
Yeah.
Who knows?
And then the females just have it because it looks good. I don't know. So the males do have those 2 conical teeth that are angled slightly forward, that are visible at the tip of the lower jaw. Sometimes they have a second pair of teeth that are erupted or that are hidden in the gums behind those teeth. So they're not erupted. And then there's 10 to 20 vestigial teeth found in the gums in the upper lower jaw. So
okay.
Used to have them, but then they're like, nah, I don't need teeth. And they can live at least 37 years. Again, we don't know. But they really like really cold, deep waters. So they live in temperate or subarctic oceanic waters that are usually greater than 6,500 feet. So these guys are they really like the deep water. And they're often associated with those geological structures like submarine canyons, seamounts, and continental slopes, very similar to most beaked whale species, but they just really like that really deep water. They're found alone or in groups of 4 to 10 individuals. They found loose aggregations of up to 50 at a time,
wow,
which would be really crazy to see.
That'd be awesome.
And yeah, they're not sure. They may be mixed in sex and age classes, but they may also have some kind of segregation, like you kind of talked about with the Blainevilles. So it's interesting that there might be more to their social structure than we would previously have thought.
Yeah.
Diving 10 to 60 minutes. They can hold their breath for up to 2 hours, but generally shorter, kind of what you're talking about. Depths of 2,600 to 5,000 feet. And they feed near the bottom on deep sea cephalopods, right? So your squid and your octopus, things like that. Fish, shrimp, and this is the coolest thing, sea cucumbers and sea stars.
So weird.
I have never heard of a cetacean eating a sea star.
Yeah.
Like I've heard of dolphins playing with sea cucumbers, and maybe they might grab one or ingest one or something. But yeah, that was to me was
that's
just
really cool.
It's crazy. Imagine trying to suck up a sea star.
Ugh.
Like the sea cucumber I can get. Yeah.
I wonder if they actually do pick it up.
Right. Yeah. Maybe.
Yeah. Well, because they would have. Yeah. I mean, the sea cucumbers are just literally laying on the floor, so it's easy to suck that up. But the sea stars would, they have all their little ampulla and they're sticking to things. How they would grab them. I don't know.
Interesting.
And the juveniles may feed on prey closer to the surface because they're not going to be able to dive as deep until they get a little bit older.
Gotcha.
Sexually mature about 7 to 11 years, kind of what we talked about before. Gestation is about 12 months, and they have a single calf, they think, every 2+ years. But what's really interesting is that a paper that just came out in 2020, like a couple weeks ago, used stable isotope ratios in the teeth from whales killed in the whaling era. So those teeth were saved, and you can do growth layers. And then depending on how those growth layers look, you can figure out these different aspects of their lives. And it indicated that weaning doesn't occur until at least 3 to 4 years of age. And the other estimate was basically 1 year. You nurse for a year, you wean, and then you give birth another year. But that was originally based on one single calf stranding that had milk and squid in its stomach.
Right.
And that's a bit much to jump to that conclusion because, for example, dolphins, the Atlantic spotted dolphins that I studied in the Bahamas, they nurse for 3 to 4 years, but they start eating squid and fish. They start eating food
solid
after about
food,
a year. Yeah. So just because they had squid in their stomach doesn't mean that they were being weaned.
Right.
At that point. So, but that really drastically changes how we think about these animals and their recovery for how much they've been whaled, and animals that have been killed, if they're only reproducing every 3 to 4 years versus every other, right?
Yeah.
It's a very different thing. And so speaking of whaling, in 1850s, it was discovered that these animals have spermaceti, like sperm whales.
Oh, like sperm whales.
Yeah. So because of that, it was very highly sought after, obviously. So they were hunted, and they also were hunted for pet food. because I guess
As you do.
that's really like northern bottlenose whales, you know. But what's different from what you were talking about, a cat with the Blainevilles, these guys are actually really curious. So if there's a stationary boat, they're like, oh, what's that? Let's go check it out.
Right.
So they'll go there, and they have tight social bonds. So they will stay with an individual that is injured or wounded. So they basically exploited the fact that they're curious and care about their other whales,
Right.
which is sad.
So
right?
mean.
So mean. There is still dry fishery in the Faroe Islands, and Canada and Norway hunted their meat and oil until the population was depleted. So I didn't realize how much these guys had actually been whaled in the whaling era.
Yeah.
And it didn't end until 1970.
Wow.
Like, it just amazes me that we've been whaling up until that point.
Right.
Yeah.
So that's what I got for the northern bottlenose whale.
Okay. So the last one that I'm going to talk about is the Bairds beaked whale, Baradius bairdii, and shockingly enough named after Baird, who was Spencer Baird, who was a naturalist.
Nice.
So these guys are actually the largest member of the beaked whale family. So they can be over 26,000 pounds.
Woo!
So just, comparative to like even the bottlenose whale, like that's huge.
Yeah.
So 35 feet typically for males, 36 feet-ish for females. So males are slightly smaller than the females.
Oh.
And the Bairds actually are one of the ones that we know a little bit more about. So we actually have a little bit more information on these guys in terms of life history and that type of thing. So also known as the giant bottlenose whale because they are huge.
At the top
they
range.
are, again, they have the visible tusks, but actually the males and females have this. So unlike the Blainevilles where only the males have it, both males and females have these visible teeth erupting in the front of their lower
It's like
jaw.
some species of cows both have horns versus some only males have horns.
Exactly. Yep. So sexual maturity reached for males between 6 and 11 years. Females are a little bit later, 10 to 15 years. So the males reach sexual maturity before females.
Interesting.
So kind of like sometimes for people, like the males are often reaching sexual maturity before females, which they're not quite sure really how that impacts their life history at this point. They don't really know why.
I would say that it would be a little bit harder because if the female, you're restricted on how many babies you can have. So if you're starting later,
right,
that's gonna
so
slow
normally
you
it would be
guys
the
down.
other way around.
Right.
Yeah. So lifespan, females live, also that's the other weird thing. Females seem to live significantly shorter than males. Females typically live around 54 years, where males can live up to 84 years.
That's so weird because it should be the other way around because males fight each other and they do stuff and they're risky and
So
and
for the Bairds,
if you couple that with them, that's really shortens the amount of time that females can give birth.
Yeah, it's backwards. So the males seem to have a significantly lower mortality rate and live longer than females.
That is weird. Maybe they're just like the Amazons. They're like the Amazon women of beaked whales.
Maybe.
Maybe. Like, I don't care.
Who knows? But yeah, I just thought that was, again, like it's really backwards in terms of what normally happens.
Yeah.
So similar look to the majority of the others that we've already talked about, large, slender body. They have a small, kind of more rounded triangular dorsal fin, so less falcate than the Blainevilles. Again, usually around slate gray or sort of gray brownish, depending on the location, and lighter underbelly. So interestingly too, there's also a smaller form of Baird's beaked whales, which are found in northern Hokkaido and the Sea of Okhotsk. I'm sure I'm saying that wrong.
Sure.
Near Japan.
Okay.
This form is actually smaller and darker. So it can be known as the black form of Baird's whale.
So this is just like an ecotype? They haven't named it as like a subspecies?
I think so.
Or different species?
Yeah. I believe this is a different ecotype. Yeah.
Right, which maybe we'll add another species there someday.
Right. Who knows? Who knows? Make it 23. Why not?
Right. 22 and a half.
Right. So again, the older animals typically look a little bit lighter due to the heavy scarring that they incur from fighting with other males, and potentially predation attempts too. These guys are predated upon by orcas. So it might be that some of those scars are due to predation attempts.
Oh, that's true. I think I have heard that.
And that's another reason why they think that the sonar can cause a flight response, because it can sound potentially similar to killer whale calls. That's their only context for what this might be. And so all they know is like, oh my gosh, I might get eaten, run.
Well, and that's the thing is that if it's kind of close, or even if it's not close, but you might think of it like it's better just to run away than to wait and go like Was it an orca? Oh,
exactly.
Darn.
So in addition to just the level of noise, they think that that might be part of that startle response.
Interesting.
Yep. So in terms of distribution, the Baird's beaked whale is found throughout the North Pacific and the adjacent seas to the North Pacific. So like the Bering Sea, the Sea of Cortez, the Sea of Japan, and the Okhotsk Sea that I can't say. And also along the US West Coast, all the way from California up to Alaska. Okay. So we do have them where we are, interestingly enough.
So
again, oh, I know, right?
I think I might have seen a beaked whale once, but it was really far away and it was in the Bahamas. But that's the only thing I could think of that was. But you saw a dead one?
Oh. Yeah, they had one strand in St. Andrews, or just north of St. Andrews when I was doing my master's over there. So, so again, they prefer the deep, colder oceanic waters, but they are also found along the continental shelf where the temperatures can be slightly warmer. And again, like many of the other ones that we've talked about, associated with geological structures like submarine canyons, seamounts, and those continental slopes. Mm-hmm. They are one of the more commonly spotted beaked whales in the field because of their large size, and they are quite social as well. Okay. So when they're at, like I said, in contrast to the Blainevilles, who at the surface are just kind of resting, these guys, when they're at the surface, they'll go through periods of resting and kind of logging at the surface, but also then they'll start spy hopping, they'll do fluke slapping, they'll be like visibly social at the surface as well. So it's a little easier to spot them when they're at the surface because they're being active.
Exactly. Like,
and they're huge.
We're over here doing something cool.
Right. And here's a huge whale that just surfaced. Right. So there's that. So again, similar to what you were talking about with the northern bottlenose whale, they have been seen in groups up to 50. Typically groups of between 5 to 20, but seems like that's a larger social group than we talked about for many of them. So it seems like these guys are a little bit more social potentially. Typical dive lengths,
and they're just doing it so far away, we just don't know what's going on.
I know, exactly. So typical dive lengths for the Bairds are between 11 and 30 minutes, but can dive for as long as 67 minutes, so a little over an hour. And again, they're looking for typically open water fish species like mackerel, sardines. So they're mostly fish eaters, but these ones also will take crustaceans, cephalopods, and sea cucumbers. So another one who are sea cucumber connoisseurs. Mm-hmm. Who knew? What else? So interestingly enough, these guys also show some migratory movements. So it seems like they will move based on seawater surface temperature. Mm-hmm. So in the summer and fall, they're typically found near the continental slopes or waters of more of those like isolated and restricted seas, like the Bering Sea, like those kind of associated smaller seas. Mm-hmm. Whereas in the winter and early spring, when the sea temperatures drop a little bit at the surface, they'll actually move offshore. So we can study them a little bit better during the summer and early fall. And yet wintertime, we really don't know where they go because that's kind of when they move further offshore. Right. But interesting that they seem to, have site fidelity and yet also will do these sort of migratory movements based on sea surface temperature.
Right. Interesting. Which will be really different with climate change going on. It's going to change things a lot. Interesting.
Yeah. And presumably that's also I'm assuming that's to do with where their food would be found and what type of food they're foraging for at those different periods. Right. So similar to the other beaked whales that we've talked about in terms of their threats, entanglement, as I mentioned before, this is a problem for these guys too. They can either become entangled in the gear or swim off with the gear and be towing it around, which obviously would impede them. Right. Ocean noise, marine debris, as we've already talked about, predation by killer whales, and then also, like you mentioned, Cindy, commercial whaling is a problem for the Bairds. So they were traditionally hunted in the North Pacific Ocean, mostly around Japan, but also in Russia, Canada, and the US. And although commercial fishery for Baird's beaked whales is now finished, we don't do that anymore, there is still a commercial whaling for Bairds in Japan.
As with other species.
So again, also that's probably partly why we know more about them too, is we have been whaling them for a while. So that's all I have for the Baird's beaked whale.
Cool. Well, that wraps up our beaked whale species. So then those are the ones we know the most about. So hope you had some fun. We had some fun talking about it. And we'll be here the next time with some more cool cetacean species or pinniped species, we don't know. And if you're interested in learning about some, throw it out on the social media and tell us which ones we should talk about next week.
Yeah.
So with that, I think we'll sign off and we will see you guys next time for a fun-filled adventure of marine mammal highlights.
Yeah.
This was brought to you by Pacific Mammal Research, a 501c3 nonprofit organization. Each species we discuss has their own write-up in our blog. Head to our website, www.pacmam.org, that's PACMAM.org, to check it out. Also, help us continue providing fun and educational content like this by donating today. Your help is how we can continue to do our work and share it with you. Thanks.